So my name is Tinka de la Corda Kawashima, and I'm a lecturer at the Institute for the Promotion of Interculturalism in Education at Hiroshima University. I'm also a CEDAR fellow, so let me share my CEDAR experience with you today. When I participated in the first mini CEDAR workshop hosted by Yamaguchi Prefectural University in 2017, I realized that I'm gaining a new perspective on community and belonging that felt really relevant for Japan's increasingly multicultural society. And that was the society where I have studied and where I have lived for almost 20 years. So about a year ago, I decided to participate in full-time 2-week CEDAR school in Uganda and Kenya. I remember that at that time, I couldn't really sufficiently explain to my family or to my boss at Hiroshima University why I need to go to Africa in the middle of the academic year. I hope this time I will do a better job. Let me briefly explain about CEDAR, Communities Engaging with Difference and Religion, is a global educational network enabling members of disparate communities to recognize and accept their differences as they work toward a civil society. The aim of the pedagogy that CEDAR uses is not to overcome difference, but rather to accept the similarities among human individuals and groups. So for that, CEDAR programs combine a unique pedagogy, cognitive learning, which are usually lectures, experiential learning based on site visits, visiting communities, and affective learning, which happens in group work, many times with other fellows. So the program is not primarily academic at all. And to explain the program better, I would like to share, actually, before I start, a story, my story with you. So I was an international student in Japan myself once. 20 years ago, I came from Slovenia to study Japanese society and religion. And eventually I settled down in Hiroshima. I'm also a mother to 3 elementary school boys. As you know, living in another culture brings a new experience. It opens your horizons about your host and your own culture. You may try to adjust, but for example, you can start eating fish for the breakfast, but you often find yourself in very odd situations, feeling discomfort when you are in the presence of a complete other. You feel your whole body is resisting you to agree with someone's opinion. And we tend to call this a cultural shock, like it would be something that you can overcome after a while. But we don't. We stick to some values we can never change. So CEDAR is what I could compare such experiences of discomfort with those provided in the CEDAR program. What the CEDAR pedagogy adds to it is a group reflection on the incident. Now imagine that you share the experience with people who came from entirely different cultures, holding rather traditional or religious values that differ from your modern secular ones. And that is the learning environment of CEDAR. In Uganda, we shared space of such continuous reflection with fellows coming from all phases of life, priests, human rights activists, Catholics, Muslims, university teachers, students, public servants, NGO leaders from different parts of Africa, and even from Bulgaria, US, Philippines, Japan, and so on. It started with lectures. On the right side, you can see the picture. And after hearing some lectures on body culture and circumcision, which was the topic of our specific CEDAR workshop, while in other schools and at other places, there are different topics that communities there are facing. So in our school, all these 30 of us fit into a small bus like this and travel to the mountains to visit communities where they practice circumcision or female genital modification, as you may know. And what happened was, on multiple occasions, all our differences came to the surface when we would be sitting on the bus, some people singing, not caring for others who wanted to sleep, or some calling Jesus when we were to fall off the cliff. And some would stay quiet, and some would constantly complain, and so on. So all the cultural differences came out in our behavior. And, as we were tired and faced with complex issues found in communities. After sharing the experiences we had on the site when we visited communities, we would reflect on them together. And for example, we would share our opinions on the meaning of a bastard, or a woman's role and a man in the community. And I remember we argued about that a lot. And we would realize that, that's because they concern those values we talked about. They concern also our own most profound values about our parents, children, family, relatives, nation. So based on our own life experiences and values. So those precise values that make us members of our own communities. So we sat together and discussed issues like FGM, dignity, human rights in the context of a local community we just visited. Well, we weren't there to solve the problems of that particular community or FGM in general, but rather to deal with the discomfort we were experiencing when our fellows' values crashed. And the more you talk, the more discomfort you feel. But at the end of the day, you begin to trust others and feel like part of community with fellows as you work toward the same goal, to build a civil society. And when you every day, all day, you eat, walk, sleep together, push the bus together, dig the mud together. The more you do these things all days, the more you feel you could live with all the rich differences everybody brings to the community. And you think you can say your difference out loud and they will accept it. So being accepted at the end of the day is worthy of all the discomfort you have gone through. So what would happen if we would tell our difference? CEDAR provides an environment where you experience belonging to a community of very different others, while remaining true to yourself and being yourself. So you don't need to change your values to accept others. Move to the question, why CEDAR in Japan? Let me show this by shedding light on local issues. The Higashi Hiroshima city, where Hiroshima University is based, has seen a significant increase in foreign residents, as Professor Oike mentioned. And of course, this is not only in this city, but throughout Japan, due to the latest migration policies and higher education internationalization. Some workers fill vacancies in fishing and other industries. Some work in the local international companies. Some are international students at Hiroshima University. Nevertheless, the city still seems slow in responding to the new situation. In local public schools, children with foreign roots already account for 5 to 10%. They are provided with additional Japanese language lessons by one teacher in a separate room in the school. So this one teacher also is the only who deals with the cultural, religious, nutritional specifics of the children with foreign roots. So they learn Japanese language in that separate room and correct posture and do homework. However, when they return to regular classes with Japanese students, they usually find it challenging to keep up with the regular class. In Japan, significant demands are on home preparations for lessons that presuppose help of one of the parents. However, due to the lack of communication with foreign parents, the consequences, such as exclusion from some activities, are borne by the children. So in the background of this approach seems to be assimilative education designed for Japan's ethnic minorities and returnees, and is based on the assimilation of difference, not on the acceptance as an enrichment in education. On the other hand, as part of the current multicultural education promoted by Ministry of Education, students rather prepare to study abroad and learn about different cultures, but they are not exposed to different cultures and languages in their own schools, and they're rather protected from them. So how have Japanese schools managed to control students' diversity and also actual socioeconomic inequalities in society? Just like any other community does, in the Durkheimian sense, through rituals, focus on something bigger than the individual member. And that is the community. So to achieve the sense of community, it's very similar to CEDAR school, and in Japanese schools, equal participation must be ensured. That is the provision of materials and supplies, universal participation in learning activities and duties, and so on. However, while the equality of participation can contribute to the sense of security and belongingness, the students who cannot keep up or don't fit in may suffer the pain of exclusion. Some teachers are sensitive enough to attend to those instances of bullying and tensions between equality and diversity. Many are not. The point is, I suppose, with an emphasis on equality, we intensify a sense of belonging in the community of a classroom or school. But we don't train the children how to engage with others who are somehow excluded from the group. And with that, we may risk becoming a society ignorant and cold to the problems of those outside our group. Well, in CEDAR schools, we learn how to respect each other as fellows. And the relevance of the CEDAR learning approach for education in Japan is, I believe, in the focus to raise awareness and engage with differences while maintaining a sense of belonging to community. And there is no shortcut to a multicultural civil society. We must provide multiple opportunities to children at our schools to learn the social skills of living with difference by confronting discomfort, not avoiding it, together with children from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds. So that's all from me. And now it's my honor to introduce the CEDAR founding director, Professor Adam Seligman. And Adam Seligman is a professor of religion at Boston University and recipient of prestigious Dr. Leopold Lucas Prize for outstanding achievements in theology, intellectual history, historical research, and philosophy, as well as a commitment to international understanding and tolerance.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kawashima. Thank you, Professor Oike. Thank you very much to the Research Center for Diversity and Inclusion at Hiroshima University for hosting this and for your abiding interest in our work and in our approach. I think I want to just go over very, very briefly a couple of technical issues, or some structural issues of what Professor Kawashima said, and pull out some broader themes that are implicit in her wonderful opening remarks. So just to remember, we're talking about a very intense program of about 30 people from all over the world, people generally from their mid-20s to early 60s. I'm already too old, who spend 2 very, very intense weeks together, learning and living with difference. Now, I want to focus on two aspects of Dr. Kawashima's presentation. One is accepting that we cannot shy away from discomfort. And the second is the importance of trust. And if you think about it for a minute, you'll see that they're connected, because extending trust to somebody or to a group of people means being vulnerable, and hence discomfort. So actually, trust involves discomfort. And as we all try to limit discomfort, we tend to put very narrow boundaries around the people who we trust. Now, if we put together this insight about trust and discomfort with another insight, which anybody who took Introduction to Anthropology in the university knows, which is that knowledge is collective. It's not individual. Knowledge is collective. Yeah. If you put those two together, you get the essence of CEDAR. So if you step a little bit outside of, mathematical knowledge or knowledge of chemistry and get into issues of moral judgments, what is permissible, what's prohibited, the boundaries of the collective, the basic frames of meaning, the way we structure our desires and our fears, these are all to a great extent collective. So what we know is intimately bound up with who we trust. So this is really the essence of the school, to learn about the connection of knowledge and trust, and to learn that we can trust beyond the boundaries of our own community. And that is the essence of the confronting discomfort that Dr. Kawashima talked about 10 minutes ago. So, maybe we could all go home now, because I just gave you the essence of what the program is about. But it took us 20 years to figure this out. We didn't start with this understanding. And maybe the best way to understand it and unpack it is to tell a little bit more about the history of CEDAR and how we started and where we started and how this grew, which is really about trust. So you see here that the program The idea for the program began in Sarajevo in December of 2001. Sarajevo was still very, very clearly in the shadow of the war that had ended with the Dayton Agreements of 1995. I assume people here remember the terrible breakup of Yugoslavia into the separate nation states, as it were, and the bloody war that took place both between Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina and Serbia, and Croatia and Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And it was December, it was Ramadan, it was Hanukkah, the Jewish holiday, and it was just a few days before Christmas. And we sat in a restaurant, and a bunch of us who had worked together on interfaith issues and wondered how we could go to a next step. So you can see here actually the picture of the reconstructed bridge in Mostar. I don't know how old people are who are seeing this and who remembers seeing images of the war, but this was a famous historical bridge dating from the early Ottoman days that was destroyed by Turđuman's Croatian forces. And this is rebuilt. This is the rebuilt bridge. When we started the program, the bridge had not yet been rebuilt, and Mostar looked like Stalingrad after the battles in World War II. The river divides the Muslim from the Catholic sections of Mostar. And if you look at the programs on the left part of your screen in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia in 2003, 2004, and 2006, in Israel in 2005, you'll see that, and for that matter in Turkey, the programs that dealt with ethnic conflict and hence ethno-national distrust. So clearly in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia, the conflicts were between Muslim, Catholic, Serbian Orthodox communities, which was horrific, because if you think that in Sarajevo, 40% of the families had been intermarried before the war. So families split up. And you know, the result was terrible. Once again, not that long after World War II, people were being really slaughtered in the middle of Europe. Israel, the conflict, as I'm sure you know, was between Israel and the Palestinians. Also religious dimensions, but really an ethnic conflict. And in Turkey, which I'll get to in a minute, the conflict was ethnic between Turks and Kurds, and within the Muslim community between Sunni and Alevi. And so we were looking at communities that essentially did not trust one another. Okay, so here you see two views of Stolac, which is a small town in Herzegovina, divided between Muslims and Catholics, and it says actually protected by an S4 tank. You see, it's not a tank, it's an armored personnel carrier. There had been 11 mosques in the town that were totally destroyed during the war. In fact, the main mosque on the place where it had been destroyed, Catholic members of the community roasted pigs on the ground so that the mosque could not be rebuilt. And what you see on the right side of the screen is members of our group rebuilding it's actually, I don't think it's a Catholic church, it's a Serbian, I believe it's a Serbian church that was destroyed in the war, but I might be wrong. So one of the things we did, and one of the things that I think Dr. Kawashima mentioned, is we do things together. And here, so in Africa, it could be pushing buses. Here was actually part of a project of rebuilding churches and waqfs, religious centers that were destroyed in the war. So here on the left side, you see a part of the ritual of the Alevis in Istanbul. And on the right side is an abandoned Palestinian village outside of Jerusalem. The Alevi Center, Alevis, for those who don't know, are a very, very large minority in Turkey and elsewhere in the Balkans and the Middle East, less in the Middle East, but in the Balkans. They consider themselves Muslims. Muslims do not consider them Muslims, consider them impure. In fact, when we ate there, a number of our Sunni Muslim participants started having tummy aches and stomach aches and rolling in the floor. And as soon as they left, they got better. So it had nothing to do with the food. It was a psychosomatic reaction. Here you see that the prayer involves dancing and involves men and women dancing together. And of course, in a Sunni vision of Islam, such a thing would be impossible to do. And this was one of the site visits that we did when we were in Turkey. On the right hand, through the barbed wire, you see the village of Lifta, which was a Palestinian village outside of Jerusalem that was abandoned in 1948 after Israel didn't yet exist. It was really at the establishment of the state, but Jewish forces carried out a massacre in Dir Yassin, and hundreds of Palestinians were killed precisely with the aim of driving other people out from fear. And this was one such village, Lifta. And I think one of the important aspects of the summer school and the combination of knowledge that we apply is you're not talking about the refugee problem in abstract in a university classroom in Boston or Hiroshima. You're talking about sitting in the abandoned houses themselves. So this was a very important insight, that the knowledge that we gain in situ, talking to people or even sitting in empty abandoned houses, is very, very different from the knowledge that we gain just from books. Dr. Kawashima mentioned the different types of learning, the cognitive, the experiential, and the affective, and I'll get to them a bit later. But it was this sort of growing realization that we learn from experience is much deeper, plays on many more chords inside than simply abstract knowledge, than reading in books or listening to a lecture. And as you can see, it has become one of the fundamental educational pillars of the school. You know, in the university, I teach a course on ritual and ornament. And I take people downtown to show them in the center of Boston, in the very center of Boston, the juxtaposition of old buildings and modern buildings, old buildings and new buildings. Now, you could just show the pictures in a classroom, but it's not the same. You don't get the juxtaposition, you don't get the 3 dimensions, you don't feel the wind on your face, you don't see the people walking, you don't see where they look, where they don't look, you don't see the other buildings around. Being there is totally different from just seeing a picture of it, which is why this world of Zoom that at least we've been living in for the past 14 months is so horrific. So if you remember the dates from the last screen, Istanbul was 2007. And you see in 2008 and 9, we moved and we did it in Birmingham, England. And something changed in our understanding when we started to do programs in England, in Indonesia, in Africa, which was we broadened our understanding of difference. So the first, 5 years or so of the program, we focused on ethno and ethno-religious difference. And you'll note something too, that all those programs, Bosnia, Croatia, Israel, Turkey, were in successor states to the Ottoman Empire. They had all been parts of the Ottoman Empire, which is, I think, an important characteristic. So our own understanding of what we're doing began to change. And I should say too, I shouldn't forget that the name of our program changed, because in the early years, the first 10 years, we called ourselves the International Summer School of Religion and Public Life. After 10 years, but it started in the 9th year, we realized that we weren't just dealing with religion, we were dealing with difference per se. And then we changed the name to CEDAR, Communities Engaging with Difference and Religion. So in Birmingham, we began to see how important gender identity and sexual orientation was, how much hostility certain people had to gay and lesbians. In Africa, and we did 5 programs in Africa, 5 or 6, the issues were tribal. We're not religious and we're not national. They were tribal, what we call tribal. Really, the differences. The tribes were invented by white people. The notion of tribes was invented by white colonialists, but it's what white people call tribal. In Indonesia, it had to do with differences between the center and the periphery, between the metropole and people living in villages very far away from any grid, any electricity, any water, anything like that. In America, it had to do with race. So we began to realize that we're dealing with difference per se. So remember, in all these places, we're bringing about 30 people, maybe around 30% are from the country where we're doing it in, and 30% are from a little broader area, and another 30% are from anywhere in the world. So we're doing that in every of these places, and they're not the same people every year, they're different people. So here you have shots from the programs in England. On the left, there is a Sikh Gurdwara in Birmingham. The right is the bombed out church in Coventry, the famous Coventry Cathedral that was bombed by the Luftwaffe in World War II. Birmingham, we did the program 2 years in Birmingham. Birmingham's a fascinating city because it has a majority of minorities. In other words, the majority population are not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, but Muslims and Sikhs and Hindus and people from Pakistan and from other areas of Southeast Asia, not what we typically think of as England. And so it was a very and there were tensions as well between some of those different communities within Birmingham, as well as between the communities in the state. So this is something we looked at, looking at neighborhoods very, very closely. Yeah. And here you see a different type of difference in Indonesia, meeting and dancing and actually having a meal with a community of transgendered individuals in the city of Kupang in West Timor. And actually the people dancing, 2 of the people dancing are Japanese fellows. One is Michiko and the other's name I forgot. But that, for instance, was a very interesting program because we went to a village in the middle of nowhere, really in the middle of the jungle, and I'll show you pictures about what they had to do to let us in, the ritual that they performed. And our Japanese fellows found an old man whose sister had been forced to be a comfort woman for the Japanese army, and they interviewed him. So this is beginning to be something also that Professor Kawashima talked about. In ways that are totally unexpected, the knowledge becomes very personal. The experience becomes very personal. Our own collective being, our collective identity comes out in the program. And this was actually a very moving, especially for those 2 young women. There were other examples of other people in other contexts. But this getting in touch with the collective aspect of yourself and seeing how it plays out is a very important part of CEDAR learning. In a successful program, people learn to see themselves, to see the other, and to see themselves seeing the other. In so doing, they can begin to question their taken for granted assumptions. And that's a big part of the program. So this is yet another type of difference that we engaged with. In other words, not just sexual orientation and ethnic and religious and national and tribal and ethnic peoplehood, but also people who are disabled, who are challenged in different ways. So in Uganda, we had a blind fellow, which was a challenge I think less for him than for everybody else, but it was fantastic. It was a very, very important learning experience for everybody. Especially we had a theater colleague, a theater director from Israel, who got everybody to take, his name was Silver, the blind man's name was Silver, the sightless man, I should say, not blind, sightless man's name, to take his position and learn what it would be like to live that way. And it was very profound for everyone. So what I'm trying to show is we try to bring ourselves and to bring everybody involved in the program to confront all sorts of different types of difference, every different type of difference that we can engage with. And that's a huge part of the program, and maybe we should move to the next screen now. You know, when I was a very little boy, my mother, I remember very well, we were walking to the ocean and my mother explained to me that we hate what we're afraid of and we're afraid of what we don't understand. And to a great extent, what we don't understand is what is different from us. So that there is a fundamental fear of difference, and yet difference is fundamental to our life. So we fear difference, and yet, as I said, difference is fundamental to our understanding of the world. Let me see how to say this differently. Okay. Difference is information, right? The difference between think the difference between a knife and fork and a pair of chopsticks. You call that, right? Yep. Small difference, totally different cultures. We make distinctions between things in order to understand them. That's the function of nouns in language. This is what we teach our children from the time they're born, to distinguish between a table and a chair, what you sit on, what you don't sit on, what you eat from, what you drink from. The very basis of life is differences. Because we're so afraid of difference, we pretend to ourselves that we're the same as other people. And actually we pretend that they're the same as us. And that's the problem. Because when I say to Mariko that we're the same, I mean you're like me. I don't mean that I'm like you. And that's the problem. And we all do this all the time, and that's a dangerous illusion. So we fear difference. Because we fear difference, we sustain an illusion of sameness, but it's illusionary. The point is, however, that difference is necessary. Difference is information. What makes us interesting to one another is not where we're the same, but where we're different, where each one of us is unique. That's what we all want. We want to be recognized in our uniqueness, in what's special to us. What's special to us is how it's different from other people. So we really cannot exist without difference, and yet we're afraid of it. So this is, I talked to you about the village where out in the middle of the jungle. So the border of the village was a stream, and they lined up on the stream, and they said that they couldn't let us in until they performed a ritual. And you see on the right, they took a little piglet and they slaughtered the pig in the river, and we had to walk through the blood in order to go into the village. They claimed that we were Dutch. You see the white hat in the left photograph, the man in the white hat, that's me. And I was like the Dutch. And they said we had never made peace with the Dutch. Remember, the Dutch colonized Indonesia. So first they demanded payment for colonialism. Then they performed the ritual. Then they danced around me anyway with very, very sharp knives. And it was a lot about boundaries of difference. But it was very interesting. So that was Yeah, this is about getting used to other people. So here you see some of the lessons we began to learn over time, and that kind of become a toolbox of how to live with difference. So one I mentioned already, this notion of questioning your own taken for granted assumptions about the world, about the other, about how life should be lived, how things should be done. Another is a very important one, is not making claims to absolute truth. Not making claims to absolute truth. We can work with people without agreeing on absolute principles. We could work together with people around a particular problem and find agreement about that without having to agree to other things as well, to principles, for instance. To recognize the partial nature of all understandings. The philosopher David Hume was credited with the saying, explanation is where the mind rests. Explanation is where the mind rests. In other words, we never can fully explain anything. We just at one point decide, okay, we've explained it enough, because there is no final explanation. And that we should distance our own commitments to our own community from our judgments about, let's say, the people in front of us. And what this leads to is to try to work with a minimum of assumptions about what we need to do with the other. This middle box is very important, this minimum assumptions needed for the to do. For instance, if I want to work with my Muslim neighbors to get the drug addicts out of the city park at night, I don't need to know their attitude towards gender and women. I don't need to know their attitude towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't need to know their attitude towards the Taliban. I do need to know not to serve ham sandwiches when we do work together because they don't eat pork. And I do need to know not to schedule a meeting during Jummah, during Friday prayer, for example. In other words, you cannot start by saying, I know all about Jews or Koreans or Ainu or Chinese or Slovenians. You don't know. What's the minimum that you need to know? Well, you need to know not to, whatever it is. If it's with Muslims, not to serve pork on Friday. If you're working with Jews, not to schedule it when they go to synagogue on Saturday, and so on and so forth. And this way, by working with the minimum of assumptions, rather than saying, oh, Koreans, I know Koreans, we can't work with them, or we can only do it this way or that way, you allow your experience to precede your judgment. You come in with the minimum possible of assumptions, and you let experience fill it out, rather than the other way around, which is what we do all the time, sadly. So here to the left, you have some pictures from the program in Indonesia. So you have a Catholic priest from Africa, a Jewish rabbi from America, and a Muslim woman from Central Asia in the middle of one of the programs in Indonesia. To the right, you have another meeting with a transgendered community somewhere else. This was in Yogyakarta. And the reactions of fellows were very interesting, actually. Some people, it was too upsetting for them. They ran back to the hotel and took a shower. And fellows wouldn't accept food that was given to them. And that then was something to talk about, of course. So again, I just want to make the point here that whereas lived reality is very complex, in the university, we only privilege cognitive learning. And in the summer school, as we said a number of times, we engage with both cognitive, experiential, and affective learning. So the living and the knowing are brought together, and we try to reframe what we know on the basis of our experience. Okay, so here, these are more photos from Uganda from 2019. And the photo on the right is a meeting of the whole group. I think that's Professor Oiki with her back to us, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. facing away from us, meeting with folk from the village, and the photo to the left is walking to the village. And again, the knowledge, again, this is just an example of the knowledge gained by bringing together abstract formal knowledge with talking to people, with being in the field, with the mistakes that you make by mistakenly walking in a sacred place. If some people might remember, we did that. This is how we really begin to understand the complexity of the lived reality of another. One of the important messages of the school, one of the important learning modes of the school, is being able to negotiate boundaries. So people come from all over the world, so that's a boundary. We have different groups in a school. We divide people into different groups, into different learning groups, what we call facilitation groups, talking, this is the affective part of the program, talking about personal but not intimate experiences. People have to negotiate membership in their small group and then big group. People have to negotiate the boundary between the group and the world outside the group. This issue of boundaries and negotiation of boundaries is an important part of the school learning. So one of the things we haven't talked about yet that we shouldn't end before I bring up, which is the importance of shared reflection. So we not only learn, we not only experience, but we reflect together. One type of reflection we call deconstruction. Every morning we have about an hour discussion about the leader of the group picks a particular salient event that happened the day before, usually something that was a little problematic, and we talk about it together. We build a shared narrative of difference. Another very important reflection is what we call facilitation, which happens about 6 times or so in the course of the 2 weeks, every 2 days, every second day, more or less, where the staff comes up with a question. The group, the larger group of 30 is divided up into smaller groups of about 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. Here we had 6, if you see the bottom photo, of about 5 or 6 people who share experiences together, and what they share in the group cannot be shared in the broader group. It stays within that small group. And we'll ask a question like, tell a story when you did not feel comfortable in your group of belonging. Or tell a story when you treated somebody for what they were instead of who they were, or where you were treated that way. We'll come up with a question relevant to what we're doing then. And this is what we mean by the affective, with an A, right? The emotional, the active, affective part of learning. And so people begin to build a little bit of trust in this group. You're sharing personal stories over 2 weeks. And you're not sharing it with all 30, you're only sharing it with 5 or 6. So you begin to understand what I mean about having to cross a boundary of trust. So this whole complicated program really only has 2 rules to it. One is that no one has a monopoly on suffering. Everybody, well, not everybody maybe, but most people come to the meetings, come to the 2-week program with the strong feeling that their group suffered more. The Africans will feel about colonialism, the American Blacks about slavery, the Jews about the Shoah, the Holocaust, the Palestinians about what Israel is doing to Palestine, the Japanese about the atomic bombs, the Koreans about what the Japanese did. There's no end to it, right? Everybody feels that. Now, the problem is that when you feel that your group has the monopoly on suffering, you don't see the other. You only see the other through the moral claims you're making on them. So you never actually see, you never actually encounter the other. You only encounter the object of your moral claims. So what people have to learn is to distance those feelings of we suffered more than everybody else. We Jews were persecuted by Christians for 2,000 years. And so on and so on. As I say, the Africans with colonialism, or the Indonesians for that matter, the Blacks in America with racism, the Muslims with Islamophobia, the gays with homophobia and so on. You have to put that aside. If you want to really meet the other person, you have to learn to put that aside. So that's kind of the most important rule in the school. The other one is you have to come to everything, because also you won't meet difference if you don't come. So those are the two rules of the whole school. Thank you very much. This has been much too long. I appreciate very much your hard work, Mariko, which is not finished yet, I don't think. But I think we should stop now because this has been now an hour and 15 minutes, so it's quite enough. Thank everybody for their patience and with this. Thank you.
異なる文化背景の人々と2週間過ごす、その中で不快感を持つことから逃げずに受け入れて他者を信頼することを学ぶというお話があった。で、自分のバウンダリーを超えた外にある他者を信頼する。それを聞きながら、ティンカ先生でのウガンダの体験談で出てきた、アフリカの一部でまだ行われている、FGM あるいは割礼について考えた。命に関わるようなこと、人権に関わるようなこと、そういったことについて、CEDARではそのようなことも排除せずに、まずはそういった考えをする目の前の人を受け入れるのだろうと思います。ですが、その後、そういったことを変えていきたいという社会活動はどうしたらよいのか。困っている人や弱い立場の人を助けるためなどの社会活動家の問題意識やパッション、これはCEDARの中では、まずそれは置いといてということになるのか、どんな扱いになるのか、それともCEDARの2週間を通して、その社会活動の在り方が変わっていったり、より多くの人に受け入れられるようになっていくということなのでしょうか。
So the project, so this is a very, very important issue. Precisely because it's so sensitive. Let me first point out that where human rights activists are very, very excited and energized and about intervention in faraway societies, about circumcision of women, nobody even knows about the circumcision of men that's done in those areas, which is nothing like circumcision in the West. I have no idea what happens or doesn't happen in Japan. What people in the West know of male circumcision is the foreskin is taken off. In East Africa, all of the skin of the penis is removed so that it becomes scar tissue. So, and it's done with homemade knives publicly, one after the other outside. So first, it's interesting that everybody is very, very excited about the women issue. Nobody even knows about the man issue. Pointing this out because it's an example that the intervention reflects the concerns of people outside of East Africa, not the concerns of people in East Africa. Nobody is intervening in matters of electricity, food, education, medicine, which our situation is also pretty fatal. Yeah. So my point here is that it's coming out of concerns of people outside the society who travel 3,000 miles to intervene in a society. It's at least legitimate to ask about such a practice. In the societies where we were, if women were not circumcised, they could not collect dung to cover their huts. They could not dried cow dung that is used to insulate the huts. They weren't allowed to harvest it. They weren't allowed to take it. They weren't given access to communal grain storage. Yeah. They had to give their place in line for water to women who were circumcised. Men who were not circumcised and died were not given respect, were not taken respectfully out of the house when they died, but a hole was made in the wall and the noose was put around their neck and they were pulled out like a dog. Okay, so this circumcision is connected to a whole way of life. It's the circumcision, which is a public festival, is the building of an age cohort around which societies exist. So the human rights activist comes in, sure of their own moral superiority, certain that their way of life is the correct way of life and what these people are doing is morally wrong, yeah? And with no knowledge of society and what circumcision involves. CEDAR is not interested in saying this is right or this is wrong. CEDAR is interested in building a space to discuss this for everybody involved. Let me remind you of one of the slides that we went through just now, where we talked about questioning your own taken for granted knowledge, where we talked about holding claims to absolute truth in abeyance, for instance, human rights. Talked about recognizing the partial nature of all understandings. All this was in Japanese, right? All this, you saw it on the screen. So this is exactly why these are difficult subjects, because we're saying, you know what? Human rights doesn't trump everything. It's not the only moral good. And if you want to change one thing that will transform society and you won't take responsibility for it and what it means, then excuse me, this is another form of imperialism. This is another form of colonialism that Africa has suffered for a long time, from Westerners coming in with their ideas about what was right and moral and just and so weiter. We've been doing this since the 19th century in Africa. So precisely when I say that CEDAR is a place where you learn to question your taken for granted, and maybe in other places the individual isn't supreme. Maybe the individual is seen as part of a group, and the group is important. That shouldn't be strange to a Japanese to hear that the group is important. I think that's a kind of fundamental aspect of Japanese society from the time I spent in Japan. So anyway, so CEDAR is a place where you work these things out. To begin with, to see that you're not dealing with individuals as individuals. We're dealing with individuals rooted in communities. And that's true of the human rights activists as well. So I want to say two things. One, what the CEDAR team is doing now in the areas where we visited is to work, or it stopped because of the COVID, but to work in 3 parishes with local communities to find out ways to make the circumcision less dangerous, less possibilities of it being fatal, to find ways perhaps to make it less intrusive. But this has to come through an engagement and a dialogue and a willingness to be open to the community, and not from outside with a lot of money, forcing your vision on another community. That's the whole difference. And the team there started these relationships with 3 different parishes as a result of the program we did in 2019. It had to stop because of the COVID, but we'll continue again. So the point is to make a space where everybody can rethink both the people who practice female genital modification, as well as the human rights activists who were paid by foreign governments to come and intervene. Yeah. So that's the purpose of CEDAR.
Okay, what is your advice to foster cohesion and effectiveness in groups, considering increasing diversity?
We have to approach what we don't know, and difference means otherhood. Otherhood means we don't know, right? The person who is other is the person we don't know. Not that we really know anyone, but we must approach it with a great degree, him or her or they, with a great degree of epistemological humility, with modest claims, rather than absolute claims, with modest claims. Again, I'm going back to what I just said, recognizing the partial nature of our understanding, being willing to listen. Exactly what I said half an hour ago, being willing not to jump to assumptions, but to see what you and I need to work together to complete a task that we're facing now. The task might be what Dr. Kawashima was talking about in terms of educating children from other communities, children among the 7,000 or 8,000 members of non-Japanese families currently residing in Hiroshima. What do we need to make them more comfortable? What do we need to do to integrate them in Japanese society, which means, I think, that Japanese society has to be willing to change too. In other words, it's not forcing them to become us, but building a new us, right? That's the challenge. And that's what being open really means. Whether it's these children in Hiroshima or whether it's a small group. I don't know what was in the mind of the questioner who asked the question. But it means we also have to be willing to change, which means we have to be willing, which is where we started, to be uncomfortable, to live with our own discomfort. This is where we started this program.